Good afternoon. This is a follow-up. This is a video about, I kind of want for this week, the 11th week, November 4th to 10th. I'm going to show you a bunch of videos of my own collection of multicultural literature. I wanted to preface all this because we're kind of at the end of what we're going to be reading in the textbook. Now, the first 4 chapters of Banks are theoretical. The rest of it are about different groups. And a lot of times I don't get into those in great detail. They're more like an encyclopedia of information for you. But of course, with the internet, you can look up better stuff than most textbooks have. So I wanted to pause and talk about we call multicultural books, literature, information in your school, however you want to choose. But it's the idea that I remember once when I was in Lexington and I was first there in 97, I went to the high school library to see how many books they had about Guatemala. And they already had quite a few Guatemalan students, not to mention Mexican students and others. And I found only one book about Guatemala, and it was kind of an old 1950s book about going to towns and staying in nice hotels for tourists. And it was a really aged book. It didn't really tell you anything about Guatemala. It was an American tourist book on Guatemala. It was useless. My argument here is that if that culture, if that group is not represented in the library in any way, then how can anybody learn about them by reading? And what does that say about them? If I go to a library and I'm in a place where there's nothing about where I'm from or my culture or anything about its place in the world, it's just blank. I'm invisible, kind of that denial stage. So that's one of the reasons that I hit on this really hard. And of course, I have tons of books behind me, and you'll see them in the videos. But I get books because I like to read. But I got some of these books because for someday now I have a grandson. I want him to read these books. I'll probably tear them up. I've taken great care to preserve them. But one of the things is that you have books that not only represent the culture, but represent it fairly and with empathy and with an eye for the truth, historically and culturally accurate. You don't have stereotypes. It doesn't ridicule them or minimize them. It's not condescending toward them, that third stage of minimalizing people. Certainly it's not defending against them. I mean, it's saying this is a particular culture. I've got Native American books here. I've got, here's one I like that I'll just show you this one. I can squeeze it out. They're in there so tight. Called Pepita Talks Twice. And you might think that's a strange title for a book. And could you guess what it is? Well, it's Pepita has to translate for her parents. So Pepita talks twice. In Spanish, Pepita habla dos veces. Okay? And a lot of these have awards on them. And they may or may not have somebody with a Hispanic name that wrote the book, but you're looking for credibility. It doesn't have to be the name. It has to be the knowledge of the person who wrote it. This is from University of Houston, Arte Publico Press, Pinata Books. And you can look these up. These are great books. They belong to a press that publishes so many books about different cultures. And then another type of book, which I'm just going to highlight now. It's a series I got years ago. They had it, and we got it into Lexington in middle school. And it's The Immigrant Experience. And it has the history of, this one is Swedish Americans. And of course, what's cool about this is it mentions places in Nebraska. Same with especially well, with the different ones, I think the one about Czechoslovakian or Czech Americans that came over from that part of the world, or Germans or Mexican Americans, Central Americans. There are all kinds of immigrants from all over, and that whole series is beautiful. Jewish, also does Native Americans too, not immigrants, of course. Never make that mistake. That's one of the things people say. Oh yeah, they immigrated here just like we did. When and if they came here at whatever time, your ancestors probably were living in Africa, not in Europe. So, you know, you're an immigrant from Africa. Would you call yourself that? You know. Okay. I did mention in here a little story about, was Columbus really from Italy? And there's quite a bit of evidence that he wasn't really a native speaker of Italian, but was in fact a Spaniard who spent time in Italy and then came back to Spain and had to kind of cover up his background because he and his uncle had not been friendly with the King of Spain. There were all kinds of people fighting each other all over the place. Kings against dukes and against counts and against other kings. So, but people latched on. So a lot of people from Italy claim Columbus as a native son, you know. But if you try to reverse that, it upsets a lot of people. So you end up just being quiet about it because people don't want to hear a change in the story. They've got their story and they're sticking to it. Okay, so I mentioned in here in my little essay, and I've got this article from Scholastic, which is an excellent source. It talks about different cultures. And of course, this article talks about from immigrants or refugees or different language groups maybe. But I also want to emphasize that diversity deals with abilities, disabilities. It deals with experiences people may have gone through, not necessarily part of a culture, but a tragedy experienced by a group of people traveling to America would have created a different set of experiences for them. That's diversity. Poverty is diversity. Wealth is diversity. I mentioned things like here, autism, gifted and talented. I like to think about diversity, and it doesn't mean everything's diversity. What it means is that things of substance that impacted people and affect the way they see the world and the way they react, their psychology, their celebrations, their language, whatever it is, that's part of it. I mentioned sexual orientation too. That, of course, was never mentioned up 20, 30 years ago. You never talked about that. It was only talked about in a few circles very quietly. But we have other things that come out too. And as we do, then we know there's another aspect of culture there. People in whatever particular condition or status, whatever they are. I don't like the word disability because I don't want to be try to say it's a gift, but I don't consider it a negativity. So they just have different aspects, different facets to their lives, whether it's within their physical self or their mental abilities or limitations, however you want to call it. It's just different, and different is okay, you know. And I do mention in here that people get on TV and they kind of mock diversity, like, oh, is that diverse or is this diverse? Well, guess what? People are different all over. I know it's a pretty vague statement, but it's pretty damn near true. And you can't take somebody from Iowa and Nebraska and say, well, they're basically a lookalike. They must be the same. They have a different aspect to their lives, different cultural. I wanted to mention something here that I've been reading about, and I talked to my son about it because he was on the West Coast, and this is very evident. If you are known to have an opinion which is disliked by a majority of people. This can work in any direction. You can politically, if you're liberal or conservative, or if you're anti-vaxxer or pro, whatever the maybe the political or medical or whatever your situation is. If you're perceived as being different from the group, they call it being canceled or canceled out. And what would this mean? This would mean that if we were in a group and one of you expressed an opinion that others who are teachers just thought was crazy, that we would decide as a group that we wouldn't even react to you. We would just ignore you. We would shun you. That seems very cruel to me. I may disagree with some of my relatives over many things, but I don't shun them. I don't just refuse to talk to them. But I've noticed this in the making for a very long time. I had a situation where some relatives of our neighbors lived out in the country. They had relatives that lived on the West Coast, and their son had married into an Asian family. His wife was Japanese. And they had perceived over time that there was racism against them in the Midwest. And then a lot of this red and blue state got into it, the politics. This is back 20 years ago. This isn't just something recent. It's 20 years ago. And it reached the point where the grandmother, after this tragically, her son was killed in an accident falling off a house, and he drowned in a pool. And it was just terrible. And she completely lost touch with her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter. And they had always come to visit and everything. But after a while, they didn't answer the phone. They didn't leave a forwarding address. They didn't answer her letters. She couldn't even find them. And eventually, the poor old lady died about 2 years ago. And she went about 25 years never seeing her little granddaughter ever again. And all we could figure out was that there'd been a decision or something in the family that they decided that the Midwest or Missouri wasn't a very nice place, and they just shunned everybody. We don't know this for a fact, but you hear a lot of attitudes about, it started this thing back in the 80s, the red states voting Republican, blue states voting Democratic. And it got in so that division started then even. And it got so serious that people they refused to even acknowledge their relatives. And what bothered me was this old woman, Louise Ronquetto, a very nice lady, and never heard from her granddaughter again. Her granddaughter had kids, and she never saw them, never heard from them. She'd send checks, and sometimes they get cash, sometimes they were never cashed. And what I felt about it was that they just basically said, you live in that part of the country where bad people are, and we're not going to. Now, do I know that's a fact? I don't. But there were some issues before I knew about. So it really was very depressing to me. I would hope that when we teach that we keep the lines open, that I may disagree with somebody, but because they wear a MAGA hat, or because they wear some other kind of hat or some kind of a button or something, I don't say, oh, I'm not going to talk to you anymore, or I abhor what you believe in, you're deplorable or something. If we get into that, then, there isn't much hope for democracy or civility or even intellectual exchange. I guess you travel the world, you're going to find people diametrically different than you. If you only talk to people that you agree with, you're going to end up like certain people I know. I'll let you think of that as. That's what I wanted to mention to you, because this idea of shunning people is just dreadful. It reminds me of something back in the old days when somebody committed a sin and they were told, you must go away. I think it's kind of like how the Bible, when Cain was shunned and he was sent away, because he had murdered Adam in Genesis. But I don't see that. I always like to think of it this way. Imagine if whoever's being shunned or whoever's doing it, whatever, if they were our two kids, you wouldn't want to see two siblings at each other's throats and denouncing each other. I'd break your heart as a parent. Okay, I put a little article here from Joy Shioshita. It talks about diversity. I liked it because it's not just a list, but it has things. It talks about what do we look at in books that we're going to choose. And you'll see the ones I'm going to show you. I want to go over these briefly. One of them is they're accurate in their information. If they show a picture, unless it's historical, they don't show a picture of Africa in the 1850s and make it appear that that's the relationship that people had with African tribes, the big hunter, white hunter, European hunter going on safari like Teddy Roosevelt or something. Stereotypes. A lot of times, you can overdo this. I mean, you want to be accurate. You don't want to claim another culture's practices are stereotypical by the nature of them, But there may be issues that come up that are serious now, need to deal with. I won't go into all those now because I don't want to talk for an hour. But let's say that if you look at the experience of women or of children or of school systems or of the way a society is structured in a certain country, Middle East or in Africa or India or something, and you see things in it that kind of remind you of things you don't particularly like, well, just hold on to those and think about that, but go ahead and examine it. It may be inaccurate. You don't go and say, I don't like the way they're doing this in country X. Country X is sexist, country X. Well, it may be in comparison to your culture, no doubt. It may be something repugnant to you. But you have to take the culture at what it is, because then if you engage in judgment and say, oh, this culture is repugnant to me, and then what is that? That's a so-called superior culture denouncing what it believes to be an inferior culture. And that's just on you. That's your decision to declare yourself better than they are. And we've seen that all through history. And it was always whoever conquered got to impose all the rules and write the history of why the conquest was a good thing. Losers don't get to write the history. That's why Native Americans, the voice was totally eliminated for much of 100 years, is because they didn't have a voice. Their whole culture was portrayed on silent films and films and books written by Western writers, and they didn't really care much. They presented things that would sell to a large European American white population, not to people that were interested in details. I remember a lady, I got to think of her name, but she wrote a history of the North American tribes, or I think it was Indians, but she wrote it, and she wrote other books in Oklahoma. And a lot of her books were not published for a long time because the information in them and the history was embarrassing to people and their families that were still living in Oklahoma. She would write about people being cheated out of their oil leases because Native Americans in Oklahoma had a lot of Native Americans, and because they were forced to live there because people thought the land was worthless. And then people found, oh, the land has oil on it. Well, then I had some relatives, not blood relation, but I had my grandmother's sister around the turn of the century, the other turn of the century, married a Seminole tribal person and had children, and some of them became wealthy and some of them didn't, but it depended on what happened with their oil leases. So that's very interesting. Anyhow, So stereotypes and cartoonish things. A lot of the cartoon things, even from the '60s, are not really available now because they would have either cartoonish, even Bugs Bunny and some of those groups in the cartoons. I can't think of the company that produced them. It'll come to me, but they would have either Asians or Native Americans or other groups portrayed in ways that became very painful and very embarrassing. You all know about that's a Southernism. You all people that were portrayed the the Kansas City Chiefs, the Atlanta Braves, the Washington Redskins, all these where people have said they don't like the name of the team or they don't like some of the things they do, the tomahawk chop, that are really not cool anymore. Now, I know I like the Chiefs, by the way. Not a lifelong fan. I only like them because Mahomes is good. They finally have a good quarterback. But the idea that people imitate some aspects of of a tribe or something, and depending on how you do it, of course, you could say, well, it's more respectful or less respectful. But that's a very sensitive issue for sports fans. They don't like their team changing its name. But that's an issue for Native Americans. The setting, we know for a fact that Native Americans did not all live in teepees. They had long houses. They had wooden buildings. They made some of them. They had different ways. They dug burrows in the side of the earth, and there's a lot of diversity. But people have this popular image, and they keep coming back to it. Language. I like bilingual books. I would like to see a book written in Cherokee and English so that somebody could read it in Cherokee or read it in English. Definitely don't like that where they show the person who doesn't speak English very well making mistakes in English and looking foolish. That's a source of a lot of comedy by comedians, which a lot of is not really accepted anymore. Comedy's a tough job anymore. Comedy's built on hurting people. My theory is, I love comedy, but I can't pretend that it isn't hurtful, and you can get in a lot of trouble with it. That's why being funny and ad-libbing is dangerous. Epithets. You can read that part. Illustrations and how people are portrayed can be very insulting. Be careful about those. So, what I ask you to do, if I'm going to use a book or if I'm going to show a video on here, and I have somebody in my class that I think even remotely might be impacted by it, let's just say that, I will go out of my way. I'll contact them and I'll say, this is a video I'm going to show. I'm going to make it available to you. I want you to watch it. And do you think it's fair? Do you think it's unfair? You can't always protect yourself against every possible criticism, but I go out of my way. When we're going to be talking about different ethnic groups in the next month, just kind of pretty loosely, but if I'm going to portray somebody, African American, Hispanic, etc., well, you can see who I am on this screen, and I'm basically would be called a white person. Whatever I want to call myself, that's probably what I'd be called. And my perspective is not going to be that perspective. I don't know what it's like to be X, Y, Z, or N, or whatever group we're talking about. I don't know those perspectives. And therefore, when I show something, sometimes you get a little arrogant and think, well, yeah, I've read about it in the books. I can talk about that culture, but you really don't have credibility with that culture. You might think to yourself, do I have any students? Do I have any people in the community? Do I have another colleague who would be willing to talk about this? What are some issues? And because you're talking, you're getting the information from the informant, from somebody in the culture who has credibility. Okay? So that's another issue. I always go out of my way, try to find somebody. I don't go up and tell you that here's culture Z. I read stuff on the internet about culture Z, and let me tell you all about culture Z. Or if I got up and said, I'm going to talk to you about women's issues, I'll present a video on something, and I'll keep my distance from it, in the sense that I won't try to own it. I won't try to say I understand this, or I can tell you what those are, because I would respect the women in the class or others in the class to have more expertise than me. It pays really big to be as humble as you can be, and to try to avoid. Yeah, you can't brag about being humble. It doesn't work. It's kind of ironic, you know what I mean? But the point is that it's important to get other perspectives and to try to get credibility by inviting them in to talk about those perspectives. I'm trying to think if I've shown this. I think I did one this summer. I had a friend of mine down the hall who's very active in Latina issues for the state of Nebraska, Hispanic, and they talk a lot about what term do you use, Hispanic, Latina, Mexican American, etc. And it makes a big difference to them. So what people call themselves is up to whoever wants to be called. You don't get to choose, that's a sign of seizing control, trying to tell people this is how you should be seen, If I were to give an issue and talk about socioeconomic, I want to talk about poor farmers. I had poor farmers. I'd like to get a farmer in there and talk about what are issues for farmers. Makes it a lot more interesting, and you get individuals talking about it. So the credibility is again an issue. So when you're teaching in your classes, try to get as much community involvement as you can, and build up the positive before you explore the negatives. I think that's fair. I think you don't want to go in and say, let's talk about the problems in community N or S or D, whatever it is. And people say, what? I'm proud of who I am. I don't want to just come in and say, yeah, there's a lot of alcoholism in our community. There's, if you were doing Native American, or you're doing, whatever group you choose, you want a balanced perspective. And I would like that balancing to be done by somebody who's from that community. And particularly if you do this online on a video, because you put a video out there, it's out there forever. I'm taking a chance by doing these. I think it's important. I do put these on a public YouTube. I try to be careful. I'm not going to go out and say, certainly don't want to be offensive, but I also want to be as accurate as possible. So, I'm constantly thinking about this. So I'm not going to be quite as I'll let somebody who's part of that culture criticize that culture more than I will ever do that. I also look for good stories, look for tough issues. We dealing with immigration and either refugees or something. We got to deal with some of the stuff going on now in this political environment we're in right now. We can't just pretend that, we're going to talk about refugees and immigrants, but we're not going to talk about anybody saying anything negative about them. So that's where you can get in a lot of trouble, even in just talking in class, because people say, well, you were disrespectful toward the flag or the president, or you were disrespectful toward this group because you promoted the administration's viewpoint, and or you did this or you did that, you can see how that could blow up on you in a community. That's why when I caution you about teaching multiculturally, don't go off on tangents. Don't go off on a rant. Even though you're not on a video, that's my Three Stooges. If you're not on a video, but you could be recorded, and I would definitely opt not to be recorded. First of all, you can't take it back if you're not in charge. See, if I don't like what I say on there and I think I made a mistake, I can just wipe it out and start over again. But so that's why I think teaching multiculturally is not some laissez-faire or do whatever you want kind of thing. I think you have to think of it very carefully. So that's why I wanted to give you this list. Now I'm going to show you the videos. You can look at least 3 of them. But I go through these, and you don't have to look at them all this week. But I just want to give some ideas about kinds of books available, and there are some really cool books I have. And I invite you in your discussion to share any books you may have, if you want to do that. Okay. Now we're going to be doing the final project, and I've listed an annotated bibliography. I think it was 20 items. I would like somebody asked me on a video or on an email, do you have to know them personally? Well, you have to examine them at least in part. I mean, you should be able to at least get a book review of a book, but you can look up websites, you can look up books. Now, I mentioned a bib because you could create a annotated bib, which means, and it explains what that is, that you give a description of about a short, not a tiny paragraph, but about a 5-sentence paragraph of a book or an article and how useful it would be, discussing if it's about Native Americans or if it's about a movie about refugees, or if it's a recipe book, even how to prepare Japanese sushi or something. I mean, you create this, and I want you each to create. If you do the annotated bib, now you can do a game or other things, but if you do the annotated bib, I chose that because that's pretty simple, pretty cut and simple, dry. It's not a hard project. You find 20 things and you go through and you write about them, and you leave information so it can be located. So you either need to have the website, or you need to have it cited, APA, so it can be located. You can do an old-fashioned journal articles, but that's not really something most people read. I'd prefer books, especially children's books. So those are cool things to put together. It's not hard to put them together, and make one that's useful for you. Don't make one say, I'll never look at these again. I said, what's the point of that? If you live in a small town in South Dakota and you have some Native Americans, look up books that would apply to them, or books that would apply to living in South Dakota. By the way, they're not just about minorities or what's perceived to be minorities. Could be about the groups that live there. I've got a book about Canadian farmers. There are people that live up in Canada, and they happen to be European descent, and they're not technically a minority in Canada, but they are a cultural group up there. Okay, so it doesn't just have to be Italian Americans or Japanese Americans or Irish Americans. It could be people that farm on the land. There are good books about that. I think farmers don't get represented very well. Not that some of you would be worried about Nebraska farmers, but they happen to fuel the economy of this state, and they matter very much. People should understand their situation. Okay, well, that's all I got to say about that. We'll give you some more information on the final project. Like I said, the annotated bib is the easiest one, and that's why I gave it to you, because it's still useful as a resource. Thank you very much. You can email me with any questions, and I am working on getting the rest of those culture papers to you, and then I'm going to start in on interviews this week as well.